All right, diving in again with another deep dive. Today, Ghana. It's a situation that's, well, kind of complicated, right? Politics, disability, respect, all tangled up. And oh yeah, it's all happening right in the middle of a heated election.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there. And it's especially interesting, given Ghana's reputation. They're usually seen as having a pretty stable democracy.
Exactly right. So our main source, it's an opinion piece by Kwesi Yonka. It's called The Gentle Giant in a Wheelchair. Really powerful stuff. At the center of it all is former President John Agyekum Kuffour, JAK, most people call him. He's 88 now, uses a wheelchair. And recently he came out and endorsed a presidential candidate. Now, endorsements, they're totally normal during elections, but the reaction JK got, not so normal.
Yeah, the criticism went way beyond just disagreeing with his pick. It got really personal, like attacking him for needing the wheelchair, even suggesting it's like some consequence of his policies when he was president.
Whoa. It's almost like they're saying he's being punished, right? Like his disability is payback for political decisions. Pretty disturbing if you ask me. I know you've studied political rhetoric. Is there like a term for this kind of attack?
Well, it definitely falls under what we call ad hominem attacks, which basically means they're trying to discredit the person instead of actually addressing the arguments they're making. But what's really bad here, what makes it so insidious, is that it plays into these harmful stereotypes about disability. This idea that disability is a weakness or some kind of punishment. That's something deeply rooted in a lot of cultures. And disability rights activists have been fighting it for a long time.
For sure. And in his piece, Yonka really calls these attacks out, doesn't sugarcoat it. He says it's completely out of line for Ghanaian society and makes the point that, hey, disability can happen to anyone, even the people mocking JK right now.
It really is a universal human experience, isn't it? Oh. And Yonka, he actually takes it a step further, he says, quote, "Virtually every home in the country today is a site for disability," end quote. So think about it. Longer lifespans, more awareness of invisible disabilities. Plus, so many families are caring for older relatives who need help. Disability in some form touches most of our lives.
Yeah, that really makes you think, right? Like, how do we treat our own family members who need extra support? Is it with compassion, understanding, or do we, maybe have some of those same prejudices, ones being thrown at JAK?
That's a tough question, for sure, and it really gets at those bigger societal implications of this whole thing. Yonka seems to think it's an isolated event, but it makes you wonder, is this a sign of a deeper problem? Like a lack of respect for elderly and disabled people in Ghana?
It's concerning, for sure. And Yonka is especially worried about how this rhetoric might affect disabled voters, especially since JK himself, he's a big advocate for disability rights.
Oh yeah, that's key. It was JAK who signed the Disability Act into law back in 2006. Huge step forward in terms of fighting discrimination, promoting inclusion for people with disabilities in every part of society.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because JK's political career is now tied up in this whole situation. He became president in 2000, served 2 terms, really focused on social interventions, including that Disability Act we just talked about.
Right, and despite his age and needing a wheelchair, he's still active in politics, campaigning for his candidate in this election. So those attacks, they're even more jarring now, almost hypocritical, right? He dedicated so much of his career to helping the community he's now being mocked for belonging to.
Absolutely. And while Yonka's piece doesn't repeat the exact insults, he describes the overall feeling, like they're saying Jake's getting what he deserves, that his wheelchair is like some karmic payback.
Ugh, that's what's so awful about it. It's not about disagreeing with his political views, it's deeper. It's using his disability as a weapon, trying to discredit him as a person. And sadly, this isn't just a Ghana thing. We see it happening all over the world. Disabled people in politics, in all areas of public life, facing these same tactics.
Okay, so we've established these attacks are messed up, potentially harmful, but let's zoom out for a sec, look at the bigger picture. Could this incident, could it be a symptom of something bigger in Ghana? Like, are we seeing a shift towards harsher political rhetoric overall?
That's definitely what Yonka seems to be suggesting. He compares the current situation to Jake's own campaigns back in the 90s.
Yeah. He talks about Kwabena Agyekum, remember? Gave a really eloquent intro for Jake at one of his rallies. Reading that, I was like, wow, what a different time.
Right. It feels like a totally different era of politics, where even rivals could acknowledge each other's strengths, engage in respectful debate.
So what happened? Is this just a Ghana thing, or is this harsher rhetoric? Is it popping up everywhere?
It's definitely a global trend, unfortunately. Social media, the 24-hour news cycle, political ideologies getting more and more polarized, they've all contributed to a more divisive, less nuanced public discourse.
And in this case, all that incivility, it's turned into this personal harmful attack against someone who, ironically, fought for inclusivity during his time in office. Makes you wonder if this is how we treat a former president who championed disability rights. What does it say about the everyday challenges Ghanaians with disabilities are facing?
Exactly, and that's a question we're going to explore more as we keep digging into this. It's a big one.
It feels like we've stumbled onto something really revealing here. This incident has sparked so much discussion, especially with the election coming up. So what are you hearing about the potential fallout from all this? Could these remarks actually backfire on the politicians who made them?
Oh, there's definitely a chance of that. Yanka brings up a good point about Ghana's population. There are a lot of people with disabilities there. If they feel like their community is being disrespected, it could really push them to vote against the offending party.
Yeah, it's almost like a classic example of how not to win over voters. Alienating a whole group like that, one that often gets overlooked in campaigns. That could have some serious consequences on election day.
For sure, and it goes beyond just the numbers, the votes themselves. This whole thing has started a much wider conversation in Ghana about respect, about inclusion, and that's got to be a good thing.
It does feel like a turning point, maybe. Will this make political parties rethink their strategies? Be more careful about the language they use, especially around disability and age?
It's hard to say for sure, but the public reaction has been strong. People are calling for more sensitivity, more understanding, not just for disability, but for all marginalized groups.
That's encouraging to hear. Yanka also mentioned something else I thought was interesting. He praises former President John Dramani Mahama for appointing people with disabilities to positions of power during his presidency. Specifically mentions Henry Dana, who served as Minister for Chieftaincy and Traditional Affairs. And he was visually impaired.
Yeah, that really highlights the contrast here. Mahama's party members, they're the ones being criticized for these insults towards JK. But Mahama himself, his actions as president, they showed a commitment to inclusion, to representation.
So it's a bit of a mixed message coming from that party, isn't it? On one hand, promoting inclusivity, and on the other, you have these derogatory remarks.
Yeah, it really shows you how complicated this is. This isn't black and white, right? Political parties, they're made up of individuals. And those individuals, they have different views. Sometimes those views clash.
For sure. And it brings us back to that question about attitudes in Ghana as a whole. Yanka sees these attacks on JK as this outlier. But could they actually be a symptom of something deeper, something more widespread?
That's the big question, isn't it? Is this a real shift happening or just a really ugly moment in an otherwise positive journey?
I'm curious, from your perspective studying political rhetoric, what are some of the things pushing this trend towards harsher, more personal attacks in Ghana, but also globally?
Oh, there are a bunch of factors at play. Social media is definitely one. It creates these echo chambers, right, where people only see information that confirms what they already believe. And being the loudest, the most outrageous voice, that gets you attention, rewards.
It's like a race to the bottom. Who can be the most inflammatory?
Exactly. And then you add the 24-hour news cycle on top of that. News outlets, they're constantly fighting for attention. And the stories that grab it, the ones that get clicks and views, they're often the ones filled with conflict, with controversy, sensationalized stuff.
So the media, in a way, they're incentivized to amplify that divisive rhetoric.
Yeah, to some extent, that's definitely happening. And then you have the polarization of political ideologies. It's getting harder and harder for people to find common ground, to have respectful debates with those who hold different views.
It feels like we're losing the ability to disagree without, demonizing each other.
That's a real concern. And when you mix all those factors with those deeply ingrained prejudices, the ones we're seeing aimed at JK, it creates a truly toxic environment.
So how do we fight back? What's the antidote? How do we reverse this trend and get back to more respectful, inclusive dialogue? In politics, but also in life in general.
Well, it's a complicated challenge, but I think it starts with education, with raising awareness. We need to understand the history of these harmful stereotypes, the damage they do, and we have to be willing to challenge them when we see them, even when it's uncomfortable.
So recognizing our own biases and doing the work to unlearn them.
Exactly, and it's also about holding our leaders accountable, holding our institutions accountable, for promoting inclusivity, for creating a climate of respect.
Speaking of leadership, Yanka points out this really interesting contrast in how different leaders have approached inclusion for people with disabilities. You have JK signing the Disability Act, actively campaigning for those rights, and then you have these attacks against him, completely ignoring what he's done, the progress he made.
It's a stark reminder that progress isn't a straight line, right? There are going to be bumps in the road, setbacks, challenges, but it also shows how important it is to have those role models, those who are willing to speak out against injustice, to champion inclusivity, even when they're facing adversity.
People like JK, leading by example, showing that disability is not a barrier to leadership, to being part of public life.
Exactly, and those examples can be so powerful in changing attitudes.
It's like that saying, you can't be what you can't see. When people see individuals with disabilities succeeding in all kinds of fields, it challenges those old assumptions, those prejudices, and it opens up new possibilities.
It's also crucial to amplify the voices of disabled people themselves. Too often, they're left out of the conversations that directly affect them.
Their perspectives, their experiences, they're essential for creating real change.
Absolutely. It's not enough to just talk about inclusion. We need to build spaces where disabled people can share their stories, advocate for their needs, be fully involved in shaping the policies that impact their lives.
So as we start to wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways you hope our listeners are walking away with?
Well, I think this incident has really laid bare some uncomfortable truths about politics, about disability, about respect in Ghana. It's forced us to face those harmful stereotypes and how they can show up in the most unexpected places.
And it's raised some really big questions about how we talk to each other, about the direction political discourse is heading in, not just in Ghana, but worldwide. Is this kind of rhetoric the new normal? And if so, what does that mean for our democracies, for our ability to have meaningful conversations, to bridge those differences?
We've also seen how individual actions can make a difference, like JK signing that Disability Act or Mahama appointing a visually impaired minister. Those things contribute to progress, however bumpy the road might be. It's a reminder that change does happen. It might not be overnight, but it happens.
It's like that quote from Margaret Mead, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has."
Powerful words.
So one last thought-provoking question for our listeners. How can this incident, as messy as it is, be a catalyst for more conversations about inclusivity, about respectful dialogue in Ghana, especially with the election on the horizon?
That's something we should all be thinking about, no matter where we are. How can we promote respectful dialogue, challenge those harmful stereotypes? How can we create a world that's more inclusive for everyone? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been great.
It really has. Thanks for your insights. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We hope this has given you something to think about and encourage you to keep these important conversations going in your own communities.